So I just wanted to make clear up front that while the title is called a deep dive on North Korea's S&T policies, this is, as Dr. Kang said, this is a relatively new project that we'll be launching. And he's asked me to talk a little bit more about 38 North itself, what we do, why we do it, why topics like North Korea's S&T, science and technology matter to the work that we do. So this will be less about actual insights on science and technology yet, and more about the how and why we do deep dives like this, like on the economy, like on science and technology, because actually one of the leading experts on science and technology is Dr. Kang himself. So there's little that I think I can tell him that he wouldn't already know. And so this is just a brief overview of what we hope to cover today, why we study North Korea's internal affairs, how does it affect policy, looking at a little bit of sourcing. This is a hard target, and so how we find sources and what sources we find matter to how we approach these issues. We'll look at sort of the comparative approach of how we've done these deep dives on economic policymaking, for instance, and then an intro to our science and technology project. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Stimson Center itself, we are based in Washington, D.C. The center promotes international security and shared prosperity through applied research and independent analysis, global engagement, and policy and innovation. For more than 30 years, actually, Stimson has been a leading voice on urgent global issues. It was founded in the twilight of the Cold War and has pioneered practical new steps towards stability and security in an uncertain world. And so as power and technology are changing the way that we deal with modern challenges, Stimson is at the forefront, engaging new voices, generating innovative ideas and analysis, and building solutions to promote international security, prosperity, and justice. 38 North, we've actually been at Stimson Center since 2018. We started in 2010. Joel Witt and I started this project in 2010 while we were still at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies at the U.S. Korea Institute there. Our goal is really, to elevate the policy discourse and the public policy discourse on North Korea. Again, this is an issue we consider a hard target. And so oftentimes getting credible information about it is difficult. And so people tend to chalk it up to being a country that's unknowable and don't really try. So our goal is really to dig deeper, learn what we can, tap into a network of people who have direct knowledge, either working with North Koreans, working in North Korea, to share what they know, how they know it, and provide a platform for them to provide their analysis. And we really encourage them also to show their work. How did they come to the conclusions they did, so that we can also evaluate the credibility of those analyses. I think the Stimson, our 38 North program is most known for our work on weapons of mass destruction, on the nuclear program, but we do cover a range of issues that work to better understand where North Korea is today, how it is evolving, what its self-perceptions are in a changing geopolitical landscape, and then how that potentially affects its foreign policy and external relations, and especially its relations with the United States, with South Korea, and the implications for the inter-Korean discourse. Our program, we really do focus on a range of, not only a range of issues, we do policy research and recommendations. We do informal diplomacy with both the North Koreans themselves as well as with regional stakeholders. And we also have the website 38north.org that I'm assuming, and I hope that many of you are familiar with. If you're not, 38 North provides informed policy and technical analysis on developments in and around North Korea. And again, and really the implications for both its internal developments, internal affairs, and external affairs. And hopefully you'll check it out. So the question is of course, why do we study North Korea's internal affairs? And really, the way we approach this is more of a holistic approach to understanding North Korea. For most Americans, I think, all they know about North Korea is that they have nuclear weapons, and that they're the ultimate villain in the media and in pop culture. And it creates this sense of this caricature about North Korea that makes it very easy then to dismiss the idea that North Korea has agency and that it has its own strategic interests, and that it will act on those interests, and be guided by those interests along the way. But I think it's important to remember that North Korea is more than just Kim Jong-un. It's more than the regime itself. It's more than its nuclear program. This is a country of 26 million people who are also trying to live meaningful lives in a country where there's a multiplicity of life experiences depending on who you are, what your social status is, where you live, from the elites in Pyongyang to ordinary people who have become merchants to try and improve their own lives and standing, to the poorest of the poor in the rural regions and outskirts of the country. And so for these 26 million people, we really need to get our politics right. Um, and at the same time, though, our approach to North Korea tends to be, because of its political system, because of its human rights situation, because of their nuclear program, our approach has generally been to isolate North Korea, to ostracize and dismiss them, with the underlying premise of if we isolate and pressure them enough, the regime will have no other choice but to choose the path that we want them to take. But I think they've proven resilient to this approach for 70 years so far. And, I think at the same time, while we're applying military, political, and economic pressure to force this change, um, and, this really punitive approach to the government itself, we always talk about trying to win the hearts and minds of the people, trying to get information to the people, trying to get access to the people, and trying, not to hurt the people while we deal with the government itself. Um, in which then, if you're evaluating the approaches that we're taking that target the government, of course, the unintended consequences are that we're also cutting off our own opportunities for access, exposure, exchange, and learning, both about uh, both us about them and them about the outside world. Um, and so the unintended consequences of being of are really of being limiting economic opportunity within the country due to the lack of resources for the people, limiting the success of potential economic reform measures, limiting the growth of markets and entrepreneurship domestically that have been thriving, had been growing over the years, and essentially making the people more dependent on their government over time, which is the exact opposite of actually what we would like to see and what we would like to see happen. And just for perspective, if you look at the past approach of how we approach the Soviet Union, the United States back in 1956, as stated by the National Security Council, NSC 5607, we had 5 major objectives, and these were really to win the hearts and minds of the people, to broaden and deepen relations with the Soviet Union, expanding contacts, especially people-to-people contacts, creating joint activities, developing habits of cooperation, ending the isolation and inward orientation, opening it to the world, trying to improve understanding through, access, education, exchanges, and really to benefit from long range cooperation in culture, education, science, and technology. And our contemporary approach to North Korea and other countries now where we have political differences and ideological differences is now completely opposite of what we used to do. And I think we really need to rethink what we're trying to accomplish. The comparison back to those days of the Soviet Union, the watchwords of these exchanges were really equality, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. And there are numerous examples of how that outreach and those programs did change perceptions over time, both them of us and us of them. So that's sort of the background of why we look at the internal affairs as well, why we care about North Korea beyond the nuclear program itself. And again, the how we need to get this right, and how we need to do better in the policies that we have. Um, of course, again, North Korea is a hard target. It's very difficult to find sources of information. It is one of those countries where you really have to try and put in the effort. It isn't as simple as just surfing the web and reading the daily news. Um, but there are sources of information, and several of them North Korean sources themselves. What the North Korean state media does provide, both print and video, oftentimes is useful if you can sort through the propaganda and really pull out the information, but also look at it also with a critical eye of why are they telling us the things that they tell us. There's also academic journals that we try to get a hold of as much as possible, and secondary sources such as North Korean outlets outside of North Korea, or web-based sources like Uri Minjokuri, Chosun Shinbo, and other voices that help illuminate some of the North Korean thinking, but aren't necessarily central to the North Korean apparatus. There's also a lot of work that's done using mirror statistics, especially when it comes to trade. The North Koreans don't give us hard data when it comes to their trade numbers or their budget numbers. And so some of it is piecing together stories from outside sources, and trying to figure out how they fit together. We also have satellite imagery, especially commercial satellite imagery in the open source world, to help try and provide some ground truth to what we're seeing, versus what might be told in the North Korean media. Do actions actually match the priorities they talk about? Are projects really, especially big construction projects, really moving forward the way that the North Koreans are suggesting they are, things like that. And then, of course, human intelligence, as many people that have been through North Korea, visited North Korea, live in North Korea, from the diplomatic corps to humanitarian workers to, tourists even, and to North Korean defectors themselves, finding a range of experiences to try and cross-reference and corroborate ground truth as much as possible. And some of it is also just following the trails and doing the due diligence. And we'll talk about this more later, especially when we talk about S&T, and what we can learn from the journals themselves. So just some examples of some of these sources, Korean Central TV, they have daily news broadcasts every night that gives us a good idea of, what the regime feels is important news, and developments within the country. Academic journals themselves. And if you aren't aware, on the 38 North website, we do have a list of the academic journals on the science and technology side, the ones that are available overseas. There's a list and some backgrounders on them on our website to try and make it easier for people to navigate what sources are available. For our economic project as well, we looked at economic journals and have posted also the translated articles that we used from those economic journals on the website, and the web addresses are there. Satellite imagery, again, while we're most known for our imagery work on the WMD side, it's important, on the economic side as well. So here's examples of how we've used it to track the progress of housing projects that North Korea has prioritized in recent years. On this is in the Komdok mining region, looking at how they've rebuilt housing, especially and then also looking at things like flood relief efforts and reconstruction efforts, how they're moving along, and again, how do they match with the narrative that the North Koreans are telling us. So it gives us another point of reference to try and sort through what is propaganda and what is actual ground truth. Um, so we wanted to give an example of a project that we've done before and a deep dive of why we did it, what we learned from it. And this was a deep dive on North Korean economic policy making. And so it wasn't looking at the economy as it is today, but really trying to study what the North Koreans were thinking about their economic future. What were the concepts and ideas, especially under the Kim Jong-un era, that sort of would rise and fall, how they would introduce ideas, how they would talk about these, and evaluate them, within their own public policy discourse. This was a 2-year deep dive project, really looking at about the 2011 to current of the resources available, especially North Korea's economic journals, the 경제연구, which is was their main economic policy journal, as well as the Hakbo of the Kim Il-sung University's academic journal as well. And these two played very different roles, had very different kinds of discourse, and being able to do a systematic look at how they talked about the ideas in each of these unique ways, and then trying to match that up again with North Korean media sources, North Korean secondary media sources, as well as how this is reflected in outside external sources and statistics from places like Bank of America and other think tanks in academic studies. So we spent a lot of time, most of the first year actually really just looking for sources, looking through sources, translating sources as well to make it more accessible to, non-Korean speaking audiences, and then putting together the team that looked at what did we learn from all of this. And I think, some of the what we learned from doing this is really, how do we identify patterns of how policy concepts are introduced and promoted. These ideas generally, didn't come out of the blue, but would actually be introduced in the journals and debated in the journals in different ways, long before they were ever translated into actual policies and initiatives that would be then implemented on the ground. Um, and then the way they talked about, in looking at the patterns of how this was developed, the way they talked about these concepts would evolve depending on how well accepted they were as potential policy future, right? So they would be introduced in a certain way. There would be some period of kind of debate and discussion, and really subtle pushback on certain levers and certain concepts within those ideas. But once it was promoted, once it was adopted as this is the policy way forward, then you saw a real, push to promote the ideas, and build, public consensus for the direction that they were going. So really being able to look over time at how these patterns evolved, how consistent the patterns were from issue to issue, and to also see then, the kinds of issues that were fully had gone through the process and were promoted versus those that started to fall away, that would identify shifts in policy priorities, and again, and how these concepts would evolve over time as well, depending on how the political situation and the domestic situation would also shift. And so, for instance, there's always ongoing debates within the policy journals about, where the defense program, where the military sits in the context of the economy. Is it contributing to the economy and to economic growth and development, or is it a burden on economic growth and development? And we saw that constantly, those tensions constantly being discussed in ways at different points in time as to to show that, this was an ongoing evolution depending on the time, depending on how much, effort was really going into the military side of the equation, and what they might have been giving up in order to do that. Um, and so, unlike popular belief that, North Korea is one voice and an automaton, there is within these journals, there was also evidence of debate or tensions in these academic discourse, that really showed, the thought process that went into it, and that there is space to have those discussions and to have those debates. And so I think, all of these are really important to understanding, how the country is thinking about its economic future. Um, and some of the key findings that we found in that process, like I said, some of it was really identifying these patterns, looking at what some of these points of tension were. And I think, especially when it came to their economic management reform and their socialist economic SERMs, socialist economic reforms, I forget the whole term for it. But yeah, their socialist management system, economic management system that they had introduced under the Kim Jong-un era, would continue to evolve over time, and really trying to find that balance between centralization, what the central government does, and decentralization, what levers, what autonomy, what decisions, should be made at the operator level, not at the government level. And I think what you can see over time is a really moving up and down that spectrum of what should be centralized, what should be decentralized, depending on, again, the domestic conditions. Another trend we saw, for instance, was the idea that, economic development zones, special economic zones, these were not new concepts under Kim Jong-un, but Kim Jong-un saw the value of pulling them into a more integrated, broader economic policy. It wasn't just something done on the outskirts of the economy. And that, again, reforms can be scaled up and scaled down. And even Juche, the underlying ideology that drives this, was debated and evolved over time as well, as to what role the economy played, what role capitalism and markets played, in the broader socialist economic culture. So the policy implications, again, why did we do this? Part of the also making the, I would say part of making the translations available to the public was also so that other researchers could access them, and and do their own analysis on what they're seeing, why they're seeing it, and what they were taking away from it. And so we welcome the feedback and the debates and other analyses along the way. But our goal was really to try and, build, understand the connection between North Korea's economic goals, their economic policies, their self-perceptions of their own economic trajectory and future, and how that uh, how that evolved alongside their foreign policy. Did it create windows of opportunity? And I think that is what we saw in the 2018 era, was really, a real push, once they declared victory on the nuclear side of their Pyongyang dual development line of the economy and the nuclear weapons program. Once they were able to declare victory on the nuclear side, the policy really shifted, and the focus really shifted to everything for the economy. And I think it did create windows of opportunity for engagement, and especially engagement that would provide a foundation for greater economic development and growth. Whether we are equipped with and able to respond to those windows of opportunity is a whole nother lecture. But certainly those understanding when those windows open, and what might be areas where incentives and inducements may have more appeal I think are also important in informing future policy and trying to create better policies and better better engagement in the future. I think understanding North Korea's own economic policy making, policy thinking as well also provides opportunities within the non-government sphere and the academic sphere to think about areas in which cooperation could be built that would support momentum in positive directions. Whether that's economic capacity building trainings, business trainings, and we've seen some of this pop up over time. But there's certainly a lot of room for cooperation there. And cooperation is easier to build when it fits within the North Korean priorities. So that was an example of what we did before and sort of where we see ourselves going in the future on science and technology. And I think, science and technology is equally ripe for cooperation and equally important, to understanding where there might be windows of opportunity in the future with North Korea. And of course, science and technology beyond just the WMD. And so we're really only in phase one of this. And phase one, like it was in our deep dive on the economy, is really focused on equipping ourselves for the research, identifying sources of information, and trying to figure out, where is there information? How do we learn about this? Like I said, we have the list of the 41 academic journals on science and technology that are available overseas. Online, we have started to, gather and put together backgrounders on each of these to also help other researchers think about, what are the North Koreans, what information is available, to also inform other researchers as well. But in our early surveys of some of these journals, the goal is really to identify what can we learn from the journals, and start to cross-reference against, what's in the journals versus what's in the media. So really gathering sources right now and trying to identify key issues that we're interested in, that again would be ripe for cooperation in the future. Trying to identify leading voices in the science and technology world that can help us do the research, such as Dr. Kang, and we're really excited to be able to work with him going forward. Trying to put together educational profiles of the actual authors, because the one thing the North Koreans don't do, even in their journals, is provide bios on their researchers for us to better understand who these people are, what their educational level is, what their experience has been. And really then to identify research networks both on North Korea and on the external side to enhance both the North Koreans themselves, research networks, their research networks, as well as research networks on the external side to better understand, find people who have worked with the North Koreans in the science and technology fields, and also include their voices and experiences in the research that we're doing, to really round out our understanding of that. Here's just an example of one of the journals that is available. This one is on chemistry and chemical engineering. And this is an example of the type of backgrounders that we've put together for these. And much like the economic research that we did, this is really about trying to find those insights into the country's own thoughts about its own trajectory, what it's interested in, what North Koreans are interested, what they have access to, what they're thinking about, even if it's not necessarily implemented in society yet. The idea of trying to understand the types of sciences that there's more information on, that they spend more time on, and how they have integrated that into policy and into how they build the infrastructure for that, how they introduce it into their own universities and their own schools. These are all important things to be able to shed light on where we might find common ground. Um, the pros and cons of this research going forward, the what can we learn? Obviously, there's lots of areas of science that understanding what areas of science are being studied, at what levels they are, what level of sophistication their understanding is. In some cases, the technologies that are under study, the degree of sophistication, as well as the techniques that might be studied depending on the type of science that it is. How does it conform to or match up to international standards? Where are they further ahead than others? And again, where's there room for capacity building, cooperation, collaboration? In this, this was part of like following the trail, doing the due diligence of learning as much as we can from the journals themselves. The endnotes can often lead us to better understanding of the authors as well as their educational experiences and their research partners over time. Have they co-authored research in Chinese journals, in Western journals with, Chinese authors? Who are their research partners? What areas in which they are cooperating with external researchers? Those are all important insights into better understanding how they're getting information, how they're processing information, and where again where they're moving and where they see themselves moving in the future. What's missing in this process is, the biological or biographical data of the authors. These are all things that take a lot of effort to put together. Sometimes we will find information, sometimes we won't. It is one of the benefits, though, of the scientific journals is that there are actual endnotes in most of the articles. Unlike in the economic journals, there isn't as much of this cross pollination of ideas and outside of outside publishing. There's also limited access to the journals. The 41 that we know of and have access to, obviously these are all in Korean, so translation can take time. But these are also only the ones that are available overseas. There's certainly more that exist within the country that we don't have access to, and that we don't really know, the whole breadth of. So for example, Kimchek University of Technology, it has its own publishing house, and it produces at least one science and technology periodical, which is not on the list of the 40 that are available overseas. And one has to wonder how many other North Korean universities or branches of like the State Academy of Sciences or other work units in North Korea publish science and technology literature also. So there's a lot we don't know. We don't know, the full breadth of like the resources that they have access to, who their key partners are, what educational opportunities they have outside of the country, how their, professors are getting trained, that are training in new generations. And the other thing that's really missing from all the science and technology is any discussion on military sciences and W&D. So those kinds of that kind of information is not available, especially overseas, and is something missing from our resources. So we're sort of entering now into phase 2 of our deep dive on science and technology. Again, trying to identify experts and researchers to conduct the actual analysis in different areas of sciences, to go through, different sources within those fields to learn what we can from the sources available. identifying ways in which North Korea has created the infrastructure for supporting S&T learning inside the country, to better understand how they're prioritizing this. I know this is something that Dr. Kong has done a lot of research on, and we're really hoping to work with him more on this, and really, trying to increase the understanding of the systematic way that the North Koreans have really approached science and technology and improving science and technology learning over time. And then identifying the key journals and areas of interest where potential cooperation could be had. And again, this is, something that I think is really a value to the policy community, is, understanding where North Korea, what they're interested in beyond the nuclear issue, where we can find cooperation. There used to be scientific cooperation that happened in the past through organizations like CRDF and Syracuse University. There used to be regular scientific exchanges that went on that were very useful in trying to build, again, people-to-people contacts and understanding, enhance our, exposure. This was an area that the North Koreans were very eager to participate in, because at the end of the day, people are people, and scientists especially are scientists, and they want to be involved in the scientific community. They want the opportunities to share their ideas as well, not just be the recipient of what they think, or what we think they need to learn, and to participate in research and contribute to research on a global scale, beyond the politics, but actually focused on the sciences. And so this is something in future policies that hopefully there's room for either building into new incentives and inducements when we're looking at the negotiations themselves, but especially in the NGO and Track 2 world, if we can get past the sanctions and start to lift some of the sanctions, to ease some of the sanctions that would allow for exchanges to occur again. This is an area ripe for cooperation. And again, for designing programs in the future, especially if we're looking at comprehensive threat reduction programs, and redirecting, like we did in the post-Soviet era, redirecting scientists inside North Korea that are working maybe in the nuclear fields now. Are there other sciences that they can be redirected to, and build opportunities for them that would be equally intellectually stimulating, but away from the weapon side of the equation in the future. Some wanted to show a sort of case study of this is a short trailer for a documentary that talked about the history of science cooperation with North Korea in the private sector. And I thought I would just share this with you as sort of what the potential of better understanding North Korea's science and technology would be. So let me play this.
When is the tech made?
Growing up,
Which year?
without fail, I would all. Sorry, what?
Which year is it made?
So this the documentary was made in 2020, 2021.
3 years before?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Growing up, without fail, I would always be asked by people whether my family was from the good or bad Korea.
Sometimes scientific relationships have been utilized as a way to build relations with countries that the U.S. hasn't had solid diplomatic relations. Developing a relationship with North Korea was not easy. We built on an existing very solid relationship.
Because when scientists carry out things like international exchanges, they're not only building cooperation around some of humanity's largest and most pressing issues, they're also building an understanding of the other side's interests and values. And when you're entering into negotiations, understanding the other side's interests and values is paramount to success. And so integral to successful negotiations are things like people-to-people exchanges, and especially in the scientific realm.
The vision of the consortium was really to try to find ways to engage the US and North Korean scientific communities in peaceful, non-nuclear areas of research that could be mutually beneficial.
Mount Paektu is an important symbol of the Korean people. It's the birthplace of the Korean nation. There was some volcanic unrest, seismic unrest in the early 2000s at Paektu. And North Korean volcanologists rightly were concerned about the threat of an eruption. And they wanted to bring in Western collaborators to help assess the threat.
The volcanology cooperation with the DPRK continues to this day, but it is also impacted by sanctions and political relations. So that's really the end of my presentation.